Does that work? Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, good morning. I'm Evan Pucillo. I'm assistant professor of physical therapy at the Florida St. Augustine campus for the residential program. This morning, I wanted to share with you a study that me and a couple of colleagues from Miami and St. Augustine collaborated on. And it's instruction of learning and study strategies to improve academic performance. This study was called the LASSI study. The purpose of this study was to compare changes in student GPA after exposure to the learning and study strategies inventory. I'll go through exactly what the learning and study strategies inventory is here in a moment. But we conducted this study in entry-level PT and OT students on the Florida St. Augustine and Florida Miami campuses. The purpose really was to examine if there were any changes in learning strategy aptitude before and after exposure to training modules in targeted learning strategies. And we also wanted to see if those changes were related to professional academic outcomes in the way of grade point average. So we hypothesized that students would be able to increase their learning strategy aptitude after they were exposed to training of those learning strategies, and that those changes in learning strategy aptitude would correlate with changes in academic performance and increasing GPA. So we designed a longitudinal cohort study where we did a causal comparative design and also a correlational design too. And we sampled first term entry-level PT and OT students. We sampled and recruited them in the first term, and then we followed them for 1 full year of academic matriculation. So this is the learning and study strategies inventory. It's a well-studied, reliable and valid measurement. It's owned, the rights are owned by H&H Publishing from Clearwater, Florida. But this tool is a 60-item tool that's based on 10 scales of learning strategies. And you can see them here on the right. It's anxiety, attitude, concentration, information processing, motivation, selecting main ideas, self-testing, test strategies, time management, and using academic resource skills. There's 6 items on each one of those 10 scales. And this is just an electronically administered self-assessment. So the students go in and they rate themselves on a 5-point Likert scale for each one of these scales. And they get a score, and the score is generated automatically by the system. And it gives them kind of an idea of where they're strong and where they're weak. And it gives percentile scores based on a really, really large data set of college students from a nationwide sample. So it's been studied for probably the last 25 years in higher education, particularly college students. And the students that take this assessment will receive a scale score for each of these on the right here for anxiety, attitude, et cetera. And they'll be able to see where they fall with respect to their peers. So percentile score of 75 percentile, let's say, would mean that they're in the 75th percentile compared to other college students around the United States. So this is a great measurement because it's really widely used. It's been studied, reliable and valid in multiple samples. And we can see if students have deficiencies in certain areas, like, for example, concentration or anxiety management. What this tool does is not just give you a baseline assessment of your aptitude, but after your score report is released to the student, it gives you targeted training modules that aim to build the capacity of your deficiencies in that scale. So let's say a student scored poorly in the test strategies scale. The LASSI would email this student like a course, like a brief 15-minute module, and they would complete this 15-minute module that would help them learn how to improve their test strategies scale. And then they would retake the LASSI again at a later point in time, and they'd be able to see if they improved based on the training that they were given through the LASSI. So we went out to recruit PT and OT students, and we initially targeted a sample of 92. After exclusion criteria, we enrolled a total of 75, 41 PT students and 34 OT students. So pretty balanced sample. We initially, in term one, in the beginning of term one, gave them a baseline LASSI assessment. So all students took the 60-item measurement. They received their score report. Then based on their score report, in the following weeks during the first term, they were exposed to the automated training modules designed by the LASSI. So this varied by participant. It could have been 1 or 2 modules, or it could have been 5 or 6 modules, but these were the modules that are aimed at training and building the aptitude in particular areas that the LASSI measures. So the students took this intervention in the second step here during the first term. And then at the end of the first term, before finals week 13, 14, 15, we gave them their post-training assessment. So we took the LASSI, number 1, we gave them the LASSI training modules, number 2, and then in number 3, we collected another LASSI measurement to see if there were any changes. At that point in time, the subjects were done with the study. We followed them and collected their end of first term GPA. And then at the end of the third term, their first academic year, we collected their GPA again. So here again, these were kind of a brief synopsis of our study procedures. On the right, you can see here a sample score report from the LASSI. So these would be the 10 scales across the bottom: anxiety, attitude, concentration, and these are abbreviated here. And you can see the annotations for the percentile scores, and the student would receive this report individually. So for example, on the far right here, you would see a pretty poor performance in the using academic resources scale. That is below the 50th percentile, which means it's below the normal range. So below the 50th percentile, any student scoring there would receive targeted training modules for this specific area of the LASSI. So this student would receive a 15-minute module that they can take and self-pace to try to figure out how to better increase the aptitude of this scale here. Now, again, just to summarize, we did a baseline LASSI at the very beginning of the first term. If they scored less than 50% on any one of these scales, they received automated training modules for that scale. And there's just kind of a synopsis here from the LASSI. This was taken from the publisher, but their aim was to create these little 15-minute modules that kind of help keep the student engaged and interested in learning how to improve that area that is measured by the LASSI. And again, after the exposure to the intervention, we gave them another follow-up LASSI measurement to see if there were any changes in their scores. And here's what we found. So here's our sample, just characteristics basically, but you can see on the left column here, we have the aggregate PT and OT students together, all 75. And then I broke out just PT and just OT students. The p-value here on the right column, that correlates, or that corresponds to if there was a significant difference between PT and OT students. So you'll see here we had a total of 75 sampled. The average first term GPA was 3.25, and it was pretty similar for both PT and OTs. Again, 3.28 for the first year GPA, and no significant difference between the two groups either. What is interesting is we saw about 24% of the overall sample experienced academic difficulty. And that is if they received a score of D or below in any one course. So that would negatively impact their GPA and their matriculation. But it was pretty balanced between PT and OT students alike. Here you can see the overall mean scores, the mean percentile scale scores for each of the 10 scales of the LASSI. And there were only significant differences between PTs and OTs for the self-testing scale, where OTs scored significantly better, and the time management scale, where OTs as well scored significantly better. In addition to the LASSI scales, there's these three components of the LASSI, which are skill, will, and self-regulation. And there were no significant differences found for those between our sample. This is a brief diagram of how the LASSI changed in percentile scale scores between the baseline measurement in the beginning of the first term and the second end of first term or the end of first term assessment of the LASSI after the students were exposed to the training. So you can see here there were a number of scale scores that increased through time. And then there were a couple that actually were level or went down. Now this table here shows the paired samples t-test for each of the scales of the LASSI for participants that took the training modules. So this would be between subjects, or actually within subjects. Sorry, let me clarify that. So subject A takes the baseline LASSI measurement, they complete the training, then subject A takes the post-test measurement as well. What we're looking for here is any change in aptitude between the baseline and the post-training LASSI measurement. And I've highlighted a few here that I think were really important. We've got the two-tailed p-values, less than 0.01 here, which are pretty strong signals for the self-testing and test strategies scale. So this indicates with a pretty medium effect, an effect size that's medium in size. This indicates that these students were able to significantly improve the test strategies and the self-testing scales after exposure to training. Similarly, we see a signal with the concentration scale and then the self-regulation component, but those are lesser in magnitude, as well as time management gave us a significant signal as well. Now, this just indicates again that a subject was able to significantly increase their scores after exposure to the training modules for these scales. So we interrogated that further, and what we wanted to see is, did those changes in the scale scores after training relate to their improvements in GPA at all? So what we did was we did a paired samples correlation. So for each subject, did their improvement in their scale score correlate with any changes in GPA? And what we see is that the anxiety, concentration, test strategies, and time management scales all yielded significant correlations with GPA. Now, this tells us that we kind of see that if someone's able to improve their ability to manage anxiety or their time or improve their ability to concentrate, then they will have a significantly improved GPA because of the significant improvements in their LASSI scale scores. This figure kind of represents those two main concepts where we looked at actually the correlation between the change in GPA and the change in the scale of the LASSI after exposure to training. So this is a quadratic here, and what you can see is the change in the concentration scale here in black and the change in the anxiety scale in blue. Of note is that as one improves their ability to concentrate in black, you also see this improvement in GPA. As one decreases their ability to manage anxiety in blue, one has a decrease in a change in GPA. Furthermore, similar diagram here on a quadratic correlation, we see the same representation for test strategy scales and time management scales. So as one is able to improve either their in blue time management skill or their test strategy skill in black, we see them improve their GPA as they improve their aptitude of those two scales. So here's some of the conclusions we reached from this study that we did. Again, a year-long study where we followed these students. We saw the largest degree of change in test strategies, self-testing, time management, and concentration scales. This indicated to us that the change in the scale score after interventional training of the LASSI modules were able to be, were correlated with first year improvements in GPA, particularly concentration, time management, and test strategies. So the students who were able to improve their aptitude in those areas saw improvements in their GPA as well. Notably, poor aptitude in anxiety, which is really that scales measuring the ability to manage anxiety, was associated with a 4.9 times higher likelihood of academic difficulty. So we sought to classify those students with academic difficulty, and they had 4.9 times higher likelihood of incurring a D or an F in a course. But given the lack of a substantial treatment effect across all 10 scales of the LASSI, it's possible that this isn't really all that effective of a measure, or the trainings may not all be that effective, so that it could be considered interventional. Reason being because only about 3, maybe 4 scales out of the 10 scales were able to really move the needle in student GPA. So administering all 10 would not necessarily yield all the same results as a few focused scales. And that is our study, so thank you. I do need to recognize that this work was funded by a 2020 USA internal research grant. So thank you to Dr. Vibhor Agrawal and Dr. Goldstein for funding this work.
So we do have a little bit of time in between your sessions, Evan. So does anybody have any questions before he starts his second platform?
So are the implications for this just to use this particular program, or do you think there's other ways that we can address anxiety and concentration in students? I mean, do you feel like the answer to this is this specific program, you know what I mean? Or do you think there are more general conclusions to draw?
Yeah, good question. So my gut tells me that I think we probably need to do a larger sample to kind of get a better handle on how this might work in, a broader population. My initial thought really is, if we could somehow select the scales of the LASSI that seem to have stronger signals and test those and interrogate those a little bit further, because there's a lot of scales of the LASSI that consistently in the evidence, not just this study, but consistently throughout the history of the LASSI measurement, don't really yield significant signals ever in the evidence, which begs the question, how useful is this tool exactly? And there's actually a current study that's looking at validating and testing the reliability of the tool in PT and OT students. So that work is yet to come out, but I think there's a good base for a couple of the scales, but a lot of the scales just really don't hold much water, so to speak. And so I think there's promise to it, but potentially maybe targeting a couple scales and a broader sample to test out those further. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and like I said, that makes sense, especially looking at your data. I mean, like, again, I'm all about efficiency, so it looks like some of the modules are working, but if if the others aren't, why would we steer students to the other ones if they're not really
Yeah,
changing?
great point. And also, I think this is just this is one of the most studied tools out there in higher education for learning strategies, and there's really not anything else, unfortunately, to use that might be a better tool. So that has yet to be developed. And honestly, these are just one piece in the puzzle, so to speak, for students that are, we're looking to figure out how to support them better and how to predict their success a little bit better. And this is just one small piece of the puzzle. There's all sorts of other, factors that go into, whether or not they're going to be predisposed to success or failure. And a lot of those just aren't detected on a single measure, unfortunately. Okay, Dr. Freilinger, should I continue to the next?